I was sitting at the kitchen island in our condo in Charlotte, North Carolina, on a stormy Thursday night, the kind where the rain lashes sideways against the balcony glass, and thunder rolls low enough to rattle the light fixtures, finishing a security audit for a fintech client whose entire reputation depended on whether I could find a vulnerability before someone else did, when my wife, Allison Parker, walked in carrying a rigid leather portfolio that looked like it belonged in a courtroom, rather than in our living room. And the second she placed it carefully in front of me and said we need to have a serious conversation, I felt something shift in the air between us, because she never brings work props into personal discussions. She keeps her career as a corporate attorney in its own neatly sealed compartment. But that night she crossed an invisible boundary and opened the portfolio with deliberate precision, as if she were preparing to present evidence before a judge. The overhead pendant lights cast sharp shadows across the marble countertop, and I remember noticing absurd details like the faint smudge of ink on her right thumb, and the way her jaw was set tighter than usual, because when you work in cybersecurity, you develop this reflex to catalog anomalies, to look for patterns breaking, and everything about her posture screamed controlled detonation. She did not sit immediately. She stood opposite me, palms resting on the counter, and slid a stack of printed documents toward me with the kind of calm that only comes after a decision has already been made. I could hear the storm outside and the faint hum of my laptop fan still running beside my elbow, but the room itself felt unnaturally quiet, like the seconds before a system crash when the interface freezes, and you know something catastrophic is about to unfold. Allison has always been composed, the type of woman who color codes her calendar and schedules intimacy like a quarterly review, but there was something colder in her expression that night. Not anger exactly, more like disappointment sharpened into steel. She told me to read the first page, and I saw my own name typed in bold at the top of what looked unmistakably like a draft separation agreement. My stomach dropped in a way I have only felt once before in my life, when I got the call that my father had collapsed at work years ago. And even then there had been shock layered with hope, but this felt different. This felt engineered. I looked up at her, expecting some flicker of doubt, some tremor that would suggest this was a negotiation tactic or a dramatic gesture meant to jolt me into something. But her eyes were steady, analytical, almost clinical. She began speaking in that measured tone she uses in depositions, outlining concerns about financial transparency, about trust, about choices I had made that she characterized as unilateral and reckless. Every sentence sounded pre-rehearsed, structured with premises and conclusions, and I realized she had likely been preparing this conversation for weeks, while I was buried in client reports and late-night code reviews, oblivious to the fact that my marriage was being audited in parallel. The irony was not lost on me, as I sat there surrounded by encrypted drives and compliance checklists while my own life was being dissected line by line. She referenced specific transactions, specific meetings, even timestamps. And I understood in that moment that she had done her homework thoroughly, that this was not an emotional outburst but a calculated briefing. The thunder cracked again outside, bright white light flashing through the windows, and for a split second her silhouette was etched against the storm like something carved from granite. I tried to speak, but my voice came out hoarse, and she raised a hand gently, not to silence me out of cruelty, but to maintain control of the structure she had built. She said she needed me to listen first, that this was about clarity and consequences, and as she continued methodically turning pages in that leather portfolio, I felt the ground beneath the carefully constructed life we had built in Charlotte begin to tilt in a way that made the storm outside seem almost trivial by comparison. Inside the portfolio was a professionally printed, tabbed, laminated document titled Non-Negotiable Standards for Nathan, my name centered at the top in bold serif font as if it were the heading of a corporate policy manual, and she explained with unsettling composure that her performance strategist had helped her outline clear expectations designed to elevate our 13-year marriage to what she called its next tier. And as I scanned the first few bullet points, my stomach tightened, because these were not mutual goals discussed over dinner or compromises shaped through conversation, but directives structured like employment requirements, complete with measurable benchmarks and review intervals, and I immediately felt less like a husband and more like a mid-level executive being placed on a performance improvement plan. The paper itself was thick, expensive stock, each section separated by color-coded tabs labeled physical presentation, social alignment, communication compliance, financial leadership, and strategic romance. Terminology that felt absurdly clinical when applied to something that was supposed to be intimate and organic. And under physical presentation, the first mandate read, maintain gym attendance minimum 4 times per week, with verifiable check-in logs, followed by a secondary clause specifying target body fat percentage range and suggested personal trainers she had already researched. And I could feel heat rising in my chest, because while I did work out regularly, it had always been for stress relief and health rather than aesthetic compliance with a documented standard. Under social alignment, she had written mandatory attendance at every social function tied to Allison Parker's professional network, unless pre-approved exemption granted. And she elaborated verbally that my absence at 2 recent networking galas had undermined the optics of partnership and stability she was cultivating within her firm. And I remembered those evenings clearly because I had been on deadline for critical audits and assumed she understood that my work sometimes required late hours. But in her framework, those explanations were reframed as strategic failures. Under communication compliance, she had specified respond to text messages within 20 minutes during work hours, barring court appearances or pre-scheduled client meetings. And as someone whose job requires deep focus sessions where a single interruption can derail hours of technical concentration, I felt a demand press against the way my mind actually functions. Then there was a grooming clause which read maintain clean-shaven appearance daily as facial hair projects immaturity inconsistent with executive spouse image. And that line, trivial as it might appear to an outsider, hit me strangely hard because my beard had been something I grew during the year my father died, something that felt quietly personal, and here it was reduced to an aesthetic liability. Finally, under strategic romance, she had written planned luxury date nights twice per month with a minimum spend of $400 per evening, including reservations at vetted establishments and curated experiences that demonstrate initiative and discernment, and she spoke about it not in terms of connection or affection but in metrics. Invisible signals of effort calibrated to match the lifestyle trajectory she envisioned. As she stood there explaining how these standards would provide clarity and eliminate ambiguity, I realized that nowhere in the document was there a reciprocal section outlining her obligations to me, no mirrored list titled non-negotiable standard for Allison, no acknowledgement that marriage is a system of mutual adaptation rather than unilateral optimization. And the longer I held those laminated pages, the heavier they felt, as if the weight of the ink itself carried the implication that love had been reclassified into a contract with performance benchmarks, compliance timelines, and consequences implied though not yet spoken aloud. The list continued with requirements that felt increasingly invasive and meticulously engineered, each line formatted with the same corporate neatness as the last, and I watched her manicured finger glide down the laminated page as she outlined expectations that sounded less like marital adjustments and more like a complete systems overhaul of my identity, beginning with a mandate to post curated couple content weekly across social platforms in order to reinforce what she described as a cohesive public narrative, complete with suggested themes, approved photographers, and optimal posting times based on engagement analytics she had apparently already reviewed. She spoke about it in terms of brand consistency, explaining that our marriage was an asset that needed to be positioned strategically, and as someone who values privacy and has always treated social media as a casual afterthought, I felt the implication that my reluctance to broadcast intimacy was a liability to be corrected. Below that was the requirement to share my live phone location at all times with no exceptions, framed as a transparency initiative designed to build trust and eliminate ambiguity. Yet it read to me like surveillance disguised as reassurance, and the thought of my movements being constantly monitored, logged, and potentially reviewed made something in my chest constrict in a way that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with autonomy. She then referenced the financial governance clause, which required me consult her before spending more than $100 on any discretionary purchase, regardless of the fact that we both earn substantial incomes and have historically operated with independent budgets for personal expenses, and she described this as fiscal synergy, as though my autonomy over a modest purchase threshold represented chaos in an otherwise streamlined enterprise. The next section was labeled public alignment, and it specified that I was to publicly mirror her political and social opinions in all visible forums, including work events and online discussions, in order to present a unified ideological stance that would not dilute her credibility within her professional circles. And I felt a slow, heavy realization settle over me that disagreement, nuance, or even silence had been reinterpreted as strategic risk rather than natural individuality. There was also a detailed outline under image optimization that required me to improve my wardrobe to reflect what she called her brand image, complete with recommended designers, tailored silhouettes, and a directive to retire certain items she deemed outdated or insufficiently refined. And I pictured my closet at home with its mix of suits, tech conference polos, and the old leather jacket I had owned since grad school, and understood that even fabric had become subject to evaluation perhaps. The most jarring section was titled Productivity Alignment, where she listed hobbies she considered unproductive and recommended their elimination, including my weekend woodworking sessions in the garage workshop space we rented downstairs and my long-distance cycling routes that consumed entire Saturday mornings, activities that had always been my decompression valves, my way of maintaining sanity in a high-pressure field. Yet in her framework, they were inefficient allocations of time that did not contribute directly to our upward trajectory. As she continued speaking in that calm executive tone about clarity, optimization, and alignment, using language borrowed from boardrooms and strategic retreats, I realized an almost clinical detachment that every single line described a man engineered to fit her narrative, a curated partner calibrated to enhance optics, predictability, and measurable output, rather than a flawed, evolving, occasionally stubborn human being she had actually married 13 years earlier, and that realization sat heavier than any thunder outside the condo that night. I took the laminated document upstairs to my office, closed the door with more force than I intended, and stood there for a moment in the quiet hum of my desktop monitors and backup server, listening to the storm batter the windows on the other side of the room as if the weather itself were trying to compete with the noise inside my head. And then I sat down at my desk, laid the document flat under the lamp, and read through all 20 demands again with the same focus intensity one used when dissecting a breach report, searching line by line for even one sentence that mentioned what she would change, what she would compromise, or how we could grow together rather than recalibrate me alone. The paper reflected the light sharply, the lamination almost mocking in its permanence, and I traced each heading slowly as though I might uncover a hidden clause in the margins, some overlooked subsection that suggested partnership instead of compliance. But there was nothing collaborative, nothing balanced, no section titled shared objectives or mutual adjustments. Just a structured outline of how I was insufficient as I currently existed, and how that insufficiency could be corrected through disciplined adherence to her strategic framework. Every demand was articulated with measurable metrics and performance timelines, as though the man she married 13 years ago had become a prototype in need of refinement rather than a partner with his own internal architecture. I noticed how carefully she had chosen the language, how each directive was framed as optimization rather than criticism, how words like elevate, align, and clarify replaced more direct admissions of dissatisfaction. And I recognized the tactic, because I use similar phrasing in client reports when describing systemic weaknesses without triggering defensive reactions. Yet reading it in the context of my own marriage felt entirely different, because this was not a firewall misconfiguration or an outdated encryption protocol. This was my personality, my habits, my preferences, my rhythms being evaluated against a standard I had not consented to adopt. As I continued through the pages, I realized that even the sequencing was intentional, beginning with physical presentation and moving steadily through social optics, communication compliance, financial oversight, ideological alignment, and finally productivity realignment, as though she had mapped out a comprehensive transformation plan designed to re-engineer every layer of my identity from surface to core. There was no acknowledgement of what I already contribute, no recognition of the long nights I spend stabilizing systems that keep our lifestyle secure, no appreciation for quiet routines that have anchored us for over a decade, just a linear progression of deficiencies to be corrected. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment, feeling something inside me settle into a cold clarity that surprised even me, because until that point part of me had still hoped this was a miscalibrated attempt at communication, a heavy-handed strategy born from stress or burnout. But sitting there alone with those 20 laminated mandates, I understood that this was not about dialogue at all, not about reconnecting or renegotiating roles within shared life, but about restructuring my identity to match her expectations, about reshaping me into a curated extension of her brand rather than respecting the man she had chosen to build a life with. The storm outside intensified, thunder rolling through the walls, and I found myself comparing the sound to the steady erosion of something foundational, because while systems can be upgraded and optimized, identity cannot be stripped down and rebuilt without consequence, and that quiet office illuminated by the sterile glow of LED screens. I understood that the issue was not my compliance with checklists, but the fundamental shift in how she now viewed me, not as a partner to evolve, alongside, but as a project to be corrected. And that realization altered the air in the room in a way no amount of lamination or strategic language could soften. Instead of arguing or attempting to dismantle her framework line by line the way I would dismantle a flawed security architecture, I sat at my desk upstairs with a clarity that felt almost mechanical, opened my laptop, created a blank document, and typed a title in bold that mirrored her formatting exactly, my non-negotiable standard, centered at the top in the same clean professional font she had chosen. And beneath it, I left a wide stretch of empty white space before writing a single line in. Plain text that read file for divorce, nothing more, no elaboration, no subclauses, no performance metrics. Just that one definitive sentence sitting alone on the page like a final line of code that executes without negotiation. I reread it twice. Not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to ensure there was no emotional leakage in the wording, no unnecessary adjectives, no passive aggression, just a statement of intent. and then I printed it on the same high-quality paper we keep in the office for contracts and formal correspondence, listening to the soft mechanical rhythm of the printer as the page slid out warm and precise. I folded it neatly into thirds the way I have folded countless client agreements over the years, clean edges aligned, creases sharp, and as I stood up from the desk, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not triumph, but steady internal quiet, as though a decision long forming had finally crystallized into something tangible. When I opened the office door, the storm had begun to ease, the thunder more distant now. Rain reduced the steady pattern against the glass, and I walked downstairs an even pace, not rushing, not hesitating, aware of each step on the hardwood floor. She was exactly where I had left her, sitting on the couch with the leather portfolio beside her, posture straight, hands folded loosely in her lap, the expression of someone prepared to negotiate terms, to refine expectations, to perhaps soften certain clauses in exchange for visible concessions, and she looked up as I entered with the same composed assurance she had maintained all evening. I did not sit immediately, but remained standing in front of her, extended the folded page toward her, without commentary, and watched as she accepted it with a small nod that suggested she believed she was about to review a counterproposal, perhaps a revised set of standards or a structured compromise reflecting my own conditions for alignment. She unfolded the paper carefully, smoothing it flat against her knee, her eyes scanning the page from top to bottom, and for a split second there was no visible reaction, just a mechanical process of reading. Then I saw it, subtle but undeniable. The first fracture in her composure since this began, the faint tightening around her eyes, the slight pause in her breathing, the way her shoulders lost a fraction of their rigid precision as she registered that there was no negotiation outlined, no mirror performance matrix, no attempt to re-engineer her in return. Only that single sentence standing alone in stark contrast to her 20 laminated demands. The confidence that framed her tone throughout the evening shifted, not dramatically, not theatrically, but enough for me to recognize that she had anticipated resistance, perhaps debate, even emotional protest, but not a clean, decisive exit. I took a seat across from her then, meeting her gaze steadily, and in the quiet that followed, I understood that while she had approached our marriage as something to be optimized through structured compliance, I had chosen to treat it as something that either existed organically between two autonomous people or did not exist at all. And in that moment, the space between us felt less like a negotiation table and more like the formal end of a contract neither of us would be revising. She accused me of being dramatic and refusing to work on the marriage, her voice tightening in a way that contrasted sharply with the executive composure she had maintained earlier, and she leaned forward on the couch as if proximity alone might reassert control over the direction of the conversation. But I remained seated across from her with my hands loosely clasped, speaking in the same steady tone I used during high-stakes client briefings when panic would only cloud clarity. I told her calmly that a partnership is not a performance review and that what she had presented upstairs was structured like an annual evaluation complete with compliance metrics and corrective action plans, not a mutual effort to reconnect. And as the words left my mouth, I could see that she had not anticipated the discussion shifting from compliance to principle. She insisted that I was overreacting, that the document was simply an organized way to articulate needs that had gone unmet for too long, that structure should not be confused with criticism. But I pointed out that nowhere in her 20 laminated demands did she acknowledge her own flaws, blind spots, or areas for growth. Nowhere did she outline how she intended to meet me halfway, or adapt her own expectations to account for who I am rather than who she preferred me to become. I explained that if she had walked into the kitchen with a document titled Shared Standards and included her own commitments alongside requests for mine, we might have been having a very different conversation. But what she delivered instead was unilateral redefinition. She attempted to reframe the list as helpful guidance, describing it as a roadmap toward alignment and a way to eliminate ambiguity that had created tension between us. And she spoke about intentional living and elevated partnership as though the language itself might soften the implications. Yet I held her gaze and told her that guidance without reciprocity is control, and control disguised as love is still control, regardless of how elegantly it is packaged. I explained that the issue was not the gym schedule or the date nights or even the curated social presence, but the underlying assumption that I required structured correction in order to be worthy of remaining in the marriage, that my natural state was somehow deficient and needed to be optimized to fit her strategic vision. As I spoke, I felt no surge of anger, only a deep steadiness that came from recognizing a boundary clearly, and I told her that love cannot survive inside a framework where one person drafts the terms and the others expect to sign, that respect is not built through compliance tracking, and that growth, when genuine, emerges from mutual vulnerability rather than imposed standards. Her expression shifted between frustration and disbelief, as though she were recalculating variables that no longer produced the outcome she had anticipated, and I understood that in her mind this had been an intervention, a corrective adjustment to ensure long-term success. Yet to me it felt like the quiet erasure of individuality under the guise of refinement. I told her that I was not unwilling to work on the marriage, but I was unwilling to submit to a structure that treated partnership like a corporate merger where one brand absorbed the other. And in that quiet living room with the storm fading outside and the leather portfolio still open on the couch between us, I realized that what separated us in that moment was not effort but philosophy, not ambition but autonomy, and that no amount of strategic language could transform unilateral control into something resembling shared love. Over the next 2 weeks, she attempted what I could only describe as strategic damage control, a recalibrated campaign designed to demonstrate flexibility, without ever interrogating the foundation beneath her original demands, and the shift in her behavior was immediate and almost theatrical in its precision. She began cooking elaborate dinners every night, dishes that required hours of preparation, and plating that looked like something from a culinary magazine, placing them carefully on the dining table with candles lit and music playing softly in the background, as though ambient alone could reverse the structural fracture that had already formed between us. She joined me at my gym without announcement, appearing in coordinated workout sets and insisting on spotting me during lifts, smiling with intensity that felt performative rather than spontaneous, as if proximity to my routines might signal renewed alignment. On social media, she posted nostalgic photos of us from earlier years, captions about commitment and perseverance carefully crafted to project unity, tagging me in memories of vacations and anniversaries, and I watched the notifications accumulate on my phone with a detached awareness that the narrative being presented online did not match the private conversations happening inside our home. She drafted a shorter list as well, printed this time on standard paper without lamination, claiming she would work on communication and reduce rigidity, framing it as evidence of compromise. Yet even in that revised document, the structure remained hierarchical, the tone still managerial, the premise unchanged that she held the authority to define the parameters within which I should evolve. Every effort, no matter how softened, still centered on adjusting tactics, rather than questioning the underlying belief that she had the right to redesign me, and that distinction became impossible for me to ignore. The dinners, the gym sessions, the public displays of nostalgia, all felt like revised strategies in a campaign, rather than authentic introspection about why the initial document existed at all. It was not the intensity of her ambition that troubled me, nor the desire for growth, but the persistent assumption that my identity requires strategic oversight to remain acceptable. During that same period, I scheduled consultations with a divorce attorney in uptown Charlotte, a quiet office overlooking Trade Street, with a skyline reflected in tall glass windows, and the atmosphere was composed and clinical in a way that matched the clarity forming in my mind. I brought copies of her original laminated document and my single-page response, laid them side by side on the attorney's desk, and listened as he outlined the procedural steps with the same methodical tone I use when explaining compliance frameworks to clients. There was no drama in those meetings, only logistics, timelines, and documentation requirements. And with each appointment, the abstract idea of leaving became something tangible and executable. When I officially filed the paperwork, signed in my name with steady handwriting, I felt neither triumph nor devastation, but a grounded certainty that staying would mean accepting a role I did not consent to occupy. It would mean agreeing that I was a project to be refined rather than a partner to be respected, that love required performance metrics rather than mutual trust, and that my autonomy was negotiable so long as the optics remained intact. Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, the air heavy with Carolina humidity, I understood that the most non-negotiable standard I could uphold was a refusal to be redesigned into someone else's strategic asset, and that decision, once executed, carried a finality that no revised dinner menu or softened checklist could undo. The turning point did not arrive in the form of a dramatic confrontation or a final argument, but through the slow accumulation of external voices she could not dismiss as emotional resistance, because over following weeks friends we both trusted began telling her privately that the document had crossed a line from clarity into control. Her sister, who works as a therapist, told her in direct clinical language that structured unilateral standards without reciprocity resemble coercive dynamics rather than healthy partnership, and even her own professional coach, the very person who would help her refine the language of optimization and alignment, eventually acknowledged that the framework she created conflated strategic improvement with personal dominance. I watched this shift unfold gradually, not through grand apologies, but through subtle fractures in her certainty, through pauses where she once would have spoken decisively, through moments when she would begin a sentence defending the document, and then stop mid-thought as if hearing the echo of someone else's analysis in her head. One evening, she sat across from me at the dining table, without the leather portfolio between us, hands resting flat against the wood, as though grounding herself. And she admitted in a quieter voice than I had heard in months that she had been trying to manufacture a husband who resembled her father, a man whose authority had shaped her understanding of stability, a man whose presence commanded rooms, and whose predictability had once made her feel secure. She explained that somewhere along the way she began equating leadership with control and alignment with safety, and that instead of confronting the anxiety she felt about unpredictability, she attempted to engineer certainty by reshaping me into a familiar blueprint. And hearing that admission did not erase what had happened, but it reframed it with a clarity that was almost clinical. I could see that the document had not been born purely from dissatisfaction with me, but from an inherited template she had never questioned, a subconscious effort to reconstruct the dynamic she associated with strength and protection. Whether our story ultimately concluded in reconciliation or separation became less significant in that moment than the fact that the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted, because a single sentence I handed her downstairs, printed in the same stark format she had chosen, altered the foundation of how we stood across from each other. It proved that I was not willing to negotiate my identity for the sake of preserving appearances, that my autonomy was not a bargaining chip, and that the marriage itself was not more valuable to me than the integrity of who I am. I understood then that power in a relationship is not established through louder voices or longer lists, but through the willingness to walk away from conditions that erode self-respect. And by choosing to file the paperwork, I had demonstrated that my participation in the marriage was voluntary, not conditional upon meeting externally imposed benchmarks. For the first time since that stormy Thursday night, she looked at me not as a project requiring strategic oversight, but as a man capable of drawing a boundary and enforcing it without hostility or spectacle. The document she created had attempted to redefine me through structure, but my response redefined the terms of engagement entirely, and regardless of where the legal process eventually led us, that moment marked a permanent recalibration, because it established something she had not fully accounted for, that I would rather lose a marriage than lose myself. And that realization, once visible, could not be undone or quietly filed away like a laminated checklist.